Hello there and welcome to this revision video for Edexcel GCSE History, Weimar and Nazi Germany. This is on topic 2, Hitler's rise to power 1919 to 1933. So in this video, you can see here the full specification for this part of the course. We're going to look at the early development of the Nazi Party from 1920 to 1922. We're going to talk about the Munich Putsch and the Nazi Party from 1923 to 1928. We're going to look at the reasons for the growth in support for the Nazis between 1929 and 1932. And then we're going to talk about how Hitler actually became chancellor between 1932 and 1933. So in this first part of the video, we're going to talk about the early development of the Nazi Party between 1920 and 1922. We're going to look at Hitler's early career, how he joined the German Workers' Party and set up the Nazi Party between 1919 and 1920. We're going to talk about the 25-point programme and the role of the SA, the brown shirts. So, in terms of the early development of the Nazi Party between 1920 and 1922, during the First World War, Adolf Hitler enlisted in the German army, and towards the end of the war, Hitler was temporarily blinded in a mustard gas attack, and he was actually in hospital when he learned about Germany's defeat in the First World War, and he came to strongly believe in the stab in the back myth, which we talked about in the previous video. Now, in 1919, Hitler joined a small political group called the German Workers' Party, the DAP, which was led by somebody called Anton Drexler. Now, Hitler was member 555, but the numbering actually began from 501 to make it seem like they had more members than they actually did. So Hitler was one of the very early members of the Nazi Party. So in terms of the formation of the Nazi Party, whose actual name was the NSDAP, but commonly known as the Nazi Party, Hitler quickly took over what became known as the Nazi Party, and he would become its leader quite quickly. The Nazis grew during this time between 1920 and 1922. They had a permanent office in Munich, which was one of their heartlands, for support, and they published their own newspaper, which helped Nazi ideas spread. The swastika was created as a symbol of the Nazi Party, and the party grew from about 1,100 members in June 1920 to having about 55,000 members by November 1923. Hitler's powerful speeches and leadership were a key reason for this growth. Now, in terms of the formation of the SA, or the brown shirts, were Hitler's private army, and they were formed in 1921, and they were led by Ernst Röhm. Lots of ex-soldiers joined it, and it was known for violently breaking up political meetings, especially those of the communists or the social democrats. Now, one of the things that you really need to know about is what's called the 25-point programme, which Hitler wrote with Anton Drexler. And this outlined their policies. So you don't need to know all 25 of them, but it included things like opposition to the Weimar Republic and democracy. It included anti-Semitic ideas. For example, it said that Jewish people should not be German citizens. It also promised to abolish the Treaty of Versailles, seize land and colonies to feed and resource the German people. And many of these ideas would be later articulated in Hitler's book Mein Kampf. Okay, so the next part of the course to know about is the Munich Putsch and the Nazi Party between 1923 to 1928, sometimes known as the lean years for the Nazi Party. So you need to know about the reasons for the events and the consequences of the Munich Putsch and then Mein Kampf. You also need to know about the reasons for the limited support for the Nazi Party from 1924 to 1928, how the party reorganised, and including the significance of the Bamberg Conference of 1926. So why did Hitler try to seize power in 1923? Well, as we've seen, the Nazis had been growing between 1920 and 1923. And obviously 1923 was a year of crisis for the Weimar Republic. You might remember from the previous video, this is the year of the hyperinflation crisis. And Hitler is trying to take advantage of this. Now, Hitler, leader of the Nazi Party, along with General Ludendorff, who was a popular First World War leader, they tried to seize power by force in November 1923 in what is going to become known as the Munich Putsch. Now, the Nazi Party was already popular in Bavaria, which is the area, the state where Munich is in, and this is very much the heartlands of the Nazi Party. It's where they have a lot of their support. So in Bavaria, the Nazis had 55,000 members and their own private army, the SA. Now, Hitler wanted to take advantage of the chaos of hyperinflation, and he thought he could win the support of the right-wing Prime Minister of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr, and the leader of the Bavarian section of the army, General Otto von Lossow, who together with Ludendorff would help him launch an attack on the government. I think Hitler was also motivated by what happened in Italy, where a man called Benito Mussolini had seized power in 1922 in a so-called March on Rome. So I think Hitler was very much trying to do this, and he felt that he would be able to take power by force. So on the 8th of November 1923, Hitler interrupted a right-wing meeting of 2,000 people at a Munich beer hall with 600 SA soldiers. Hitler forced von Kahr, who you can see there was the Prime Minister of Bavaria, and von Lossow, who was the leader of the Bavarian section of the army, he forced them to support a march on Berlin. He actually held them at gunpoint and made them promise to support him to overthrow the government. Now, in response, when President Ebert found out about this, he declared a state of emergency, and Lossow and the army were ordered to crush the revolt. So the Munich Beer Hall Putsch actually failed. So on the 9th of November, the next day, probably because they didn't have a gun pointing at their head, von Kahr and von Lossow announced they did not support the Munich Putsch. 2,000 armed Nazis marched in Munich, but they were stopped by armed police and Bavarian soldiers. A shot was fired and 14 Nazis were killed in the ensuing gun battle. Ludendorff was arrested, and Hitler was arrested later, having fled the scene. Apparently he was found hiding inside a cupboard. Hitler was arrested, the Nazi Party were banned, as we've seen, and Hitler went on trial and eventually was imprisoned for 5 years for treason at the Landsberg fortress. Now, actually, Hitler was able to turn his trial into a bit of a propaganda triumph, and it increased his national profile, and getting only 5 years when he tried to overthrow the government was an incredibly lenient sentence. And I think that shows that many of the judges and the legal system within the Weimar Republic had quite a lot of sympathy for Hitler, to be honest. So the Munich Putsch had a significant impact because it changed Hitler's tactics. Hitler realised that armed revolution would not work, and he would now use legal methods to gain power. He wrote his political ideas into a book called Mein Kampf, or known in English as My Struggle. And you can see the front cover of that book in the picture below. As we've seen, Hitler's trial was a propaganda success and became well known throughout Germany. Now, in the book Mein Kampf, Hitler articulated many of his political ideas, some of those ideas which had been seen previously in the 25-point programme. He said there should be one strong leader to make all the decisions. He said the Aryans are the master race. All other races, especially Jewish people, are inferior. He said that all Germans should be united in one country, communism must be destroyed, and he said the army must be rebuilt and used to invade land in Eastern Europe to create what he called living space, or Lebensraum. So how did the Nazi Party reorganise from 1924 to 1928? Well, the Bamberg Conference happened in 1926. The Nazi Party was divided on whether to win power by legal means or by force. Bavarian Nazis in the south preferred more nationalist ideas, and Nazis in the north tended to prefer more socialist ideas. Hitler's main rival was Gregor Strasser, a northern Nazi who helped increase support for the Nazis in large northern cities like Berlin. In 1926, Hitler held a meeting of the Nazi Party in Bamberg, a town in Bavaria, and Hitler made a powerful speech presenting Strasser as a communist. It helped him solidify his control over the Nazis and unite them. Now, the Nazi Party was also reorganised. Germany was reorganised into regions called Gau. Each region was controlled by a Gauleiter, which meant a regional leader. For example, Joseph Goebbels was in charge of Berlin. The Nazi Party also created organisations like the Hitler Youth, the Nazi Teachers Association, and the Order of German Women. The SS was created, the Black Shirts, in 1925. It started out as Hitler's personal bodyguard, and it swore complete loyalty to Hitler and had 200 members by 1929. Hitler removed Ernst Röhm as leader of the SA in 1925, but he returned in 1930. But by 1928, we could say that Hitler's position as leader was very secure. So the Nazis had limited support between 1924 and 1928. In May 1924, the Nazis had just 32 seats in the Reichstag and 6.5% of the vote, and this further dropped in December 1924 to 3% of the vote, 14 seats, and by May 1928, 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats. The reasons for this were that the loans from the US in terms of the Dawes Plan meant the Weimar Republic's economy was doing well. As people were better off, they were less likely to vote for alternatives like the Nazis. Welfare schemes to support people who were unwell or unemployed were popular and led to people supporting the Weimar Republic. Meanwhile, Stresemann's policies as foreign minister had restored Germany's international reputation. Meanwhile, Paul von Hindenburg became president in 1925, and he had a legendary reputation as a military hero. This helped make the Weimar Republic more popular. Ultimately, the Weimar Republic was doing well, so Nazi messaging did not translate into votes. So the next part of the course to look at is the growth in support for the Nazis between 1929 and 1932. We're going to talk about the growth of unemployment, its causes and impact, and the growth of support for the Communist Party. We're also going to look at the reasons for the growth in support for the Nazi Party, including the appeal of Hitler and the Nazis, the effects of propaganda, and the work of the SA. Now, one of the key reasons for the growth and support for the Nazi Party was the increase in unemployment. In the 1928 German election, the Nazis got just 3% of the vote and 12 seats. 61% of those elected supported the Weimar Republic, with Chancellor Hermann Müller leading a grand coalition. The economy had recovered to 1913 levels, and German exports rose 40% between 1925 and 1929. However, in October 1929, shares on the American stock market, the Wall Street, collapsed, and this was known as the Wall Street crash. America gave Germany 90 days to repay the loans. As a result, the German economy collapsed in the early 1930s. 6 million were unemployed, 5 banks went bust, and many people turned to extreme political parties like the Nazis and the Communists. And here we can see a very famous Nazi election poster from the 1930s promising work and bread, Arbeit und Brot. So what was the impact of the Great Depression? Well, the optimism of the Golden Age collapsed as the economic problems returned. People completely lost faith and trust in the Weimar Republic. Businesses closed down, demand for goods fell dramatically. Between 1929 and 1932, 50,000 German businesses closed. Food prices rose dramatically, farmers made less profit, and by 1932, around 18,000 farmers went bankrupt. Unemployment became a huge problem. There was begging on the streets, and people became homeless. 1/3 of German workers lost their jobs, with unemployment rising to 6 million by 1932. Those that remained in work saw their wages decrease. In 1932, the value of worker wages was down by around 1/3. The Weimar Republic had a comprehensive welfare system, but it could not cope. The government had little money, so had to reduce government wages and increase taxes by around 60%, and many simply relied on charity. Crime and disorder grew. Unemployment particularly affected young people, and many young people joined gangs. There was more violence on the streets. So political parties like the Nazis capitalised on the problems using slogans such as "Our Last Hope," "Work and Bread," and promising strong leadership. Now, during this time period, because of the Great Depression, support for extreme political parties on the left and the right grew, and the Communist Party, the KPD, saw its number of seats in the Reichstag grow dramatically, really, between May 1928 and November 1932. Not quite as dramatically as the Nazis, but certainly its support grew steadily, from 54 seats in May 1928 up to 100 seats in November 1932. Now, this was largely due to the economic hardship caused by the Great Depression and the perceived failure of the Weimar Republic. The German Communist Party seemed to offer solutions to the widespread unemployment and poverty, appealing to working class and other marginalised groups within German society. And you can see there a picture of Ernst Thälmann, who was the leader of the Communists. So that's another feature. And actually, this actually benefits the Nazis, because some people start to support the Nazis because they fear the growth and support of the Communist Party, particularly those rich industrialists, businessmen like Fritz Thyssen, for example. They give money to the Nazis because of the fear of communism. So the Nazi Party saw its support increase dramatically in the early 1930s, and this was down to Hitler's leadership, skills and character. The appeal of Nazi policies like work and bread, the role of the SA, the brown shirts, propaganda, fear of communism, and the impact of the Great Depression. And as we can see from that graph and the table, the number of Nazi seats in the Reichstag grew dramatically to a peak of 230 seats in July 1932, 37.4% of the vote. And obviously, after Hitler became the Chancellor in January 1933, they got even more seats. So we can see here that the Nazi support rose dramatically. So one reason for this was the appeal of Nazi policies. After the Munich Putsch, Hitler set out the key policies of the Nazi Party in his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, and it said there should be one strong leader to make the decisions. It said the Aryans are the master race and all other races, especially Jews, were inferior. It said that all Germans should be united in one country. Communism must be destroyed, and the army must be rebuilt and used to invade land in Eastern Europe to create living space. These policies appealed to right-wing nationalists. They'd never gone away in Germany, believing in ideas such as the stab in the back myth. Even before the Great Depression, the media tycoon Alfred Hugenberg had run a nationalist campaign against the Young Plan of 1929. Now, Hitler was seen as a strong leader who was portrayed as a saviour figure to make Germany powerful and strong again. Every year since 1924, the Nazis held a party rally in Nuremberg. Hitler's speeches were very powerful and could convert people to Nazi ideas. He gave his audience a sense of hope. He always dressed in military uniform, and much of the Nazi propaganda was based around his image of a strong and powerful leader. But the brown shirts were also important. They were Hitler's private army, the SA. Many had been unemployed and had fought in the First World War. They were set up in 1921 and they disrupted meetings of other political parties and could be hired thugs. The SA protected Nazi members and delivered propaganda, but some disliked their violence, while others felt they could bring law and order to Germany in a time of chaos. Many felt the SA could protect Germany from communism. Adolf Hitler once famously said, "We must struggle with ideas, but if necessary, also with fists." And this shows that violence was kind of like a key reason for the Nazi rise to power. Propaganda was also really important. The Nazis trained their members in public speaking in the 1920s. They raised money for election campaigns from rich industrialists like Fritz Thyssen and media tycoons like Alfred Hugenberg. And their policies appealed to everyone from businessmen to farmers to factory workers. They organized Nazi soup kitchens for the poor, and they used rallies such as the one at Nuremberg. Hitler would make a dramatic entrance and speech. It was full of propaganda. Sometimes there could be 100,000 people in attendance. And of course, these just show you some examples of the propaganda posters. They were very striking and caused many people to support the Nazis. Another reason why people supported the Nazis was down to a fear of communism. Hitler was able to get support due to the fear of communism in Germany. The communists under their leader Ernst Thälmann had grown in support. In 1928, an industrialist and media tycoon called Alfred Hugenberg involved Hitler and the Nazis in a plan to end reparation payments proposed by the Young Plan, and this gave Hitler massive media attention. Industrialists such as Fritz Thyssen gave money to the Nazis. This is because they thought Hitler would stand up to the communists. These industrialists and businessmen thought they could control Hitler, and the SA was seen as somebody that could stand up to communism. Okay, so the final topic we're going to look at is how Hitler became Chancellor from 1932 to 1933. We're going to talk about the presidential and Reichstag elections of 1932, the reasons for Hitler becoming Chancellor, including the roles of Hindenburg and von Papen. Now, how did Hitler become Chancellor? Well, you can see there that there were lots of different chancellors between 1928 and 1933, ending in Hitler becoming the Chancellor in 1933. And you can also see the election results there, and you can see from that very strikingly how the Nazis grow in support and power during this time period, and how other political parties are losing support. We can also see the rise in the support of the communists during this time period, as we've already discussed. Now, the reason why the Nazis became more popular was partly because the Weimar Republic collapsed, and this is because the Weimar Republic was unable to solve the problems of the Great Depression. So many political parties made it really hard to make decisions. Each chancellor struggled to get others to agree to decisions, and instead began to rely on President Hindenburg using Article 48, the emergency powers. The Nazis' main opposition parties were the Social Democrats and the Communists, but they were bitter enemies and unable to successfully oppose the Nazis. So these four individuals were really important for Hitler becoming Chancellor. Paul von Hindenburg was the president of the Weimar Republic. He did not trust Adolf Hitler, but he still decided to choose him as Chancellor in January 1933. And we'll look at the reasons for that. Heinrich Brüning was the leader of the Centre Party, having replaced Hermann Müller on the 30th of March 1930, and he ruled Germany until the 30th of May 1932. Franz von Papen was appointed Chancellor on the 1st of June 1932, but his conservative aristocratic background made him acceptable to President Hindenburg. Von Papen persuaded Hindenburg to appoint Hitler Chancellor in January 1933. And Kurt von Schleicher was a military general. He was Chancellor for a very short period of time between December 1932 and January 1933, but he struggled to win support. Behind the scenes, von Papen persuaded Hindenburg to get rid of him and appoint Hitler as Chancellor. So von Papen was actually really crucial for Hitler becoming Chancellor. So if we look at the diagrams of this, having looked at the key individuals, in September 1930, Chancellor Brüning tried to tackle the economic problems by cutting unemployment pay and raising taxes, but the Social Democrats refused to support this, and so Brüning called an election for September 1930. The Nazis became the second largest party in the Reichstag, making it harder to run Germany. Between 1930 and 1932, President Hindenburg refused to put the Nazis in government. Brüning relied on Article 48 to run Germany. Eventually, Brüning angered Hindenburg when he proposed giving land to poorer peasants. Brüning was replaced by Franz von Papen. Now, in July 1932, the Nazis won 37% of the vote and 230 seats, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag. Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler Chancellor, and von Papen continued as Chancellor. He had little support and struggled to rule. In November 1932, in this election, the Nazis lost 2 million votes and won 33% of the vote, 196 seats. Schleicher replaced von Papen as Chancellor, but he also struggled to win support and rule Germany. Now, at the end of 1932, Papen saw an opportunity to gain revenge on Schleicher, and he held a secret meeting with Hitler. Now, at this stage, the Nazis were losing support. They agreed to form a new government with Hitler as Chancellor and von Papen as Vice-Chancellor, and this eventually came into fruition on the 30th of January 1933. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Papen had persuaded Hindenburg that Hitler could be controlled. Only 3 Nazis were in the cabinet out of 12. Wealthy businessmen and landowners supported the plan as part of protecting Germany from communism. So this shows the idea of Hitler being in the driving seat, but actually von Papen being in charge, but it didn't quite work out like this. The title of the cartoon means Hugenberg's driving school. Alfred Hugenberg was a media tycoon and leader of the German National People's Party. The caption says, Hugenberg's Papen, let that newcomer up front think he's doing the steering. The real control of the economy is in our hands. Hugenberg and von Papen were also a member of Hitler's cabinet in January 1933. What happened, of course, was not quite what Hugenberg and von Papen had planned, and in the next video we're going to talk about how Hitler controlled people in Nazi Germany, how he changed Germany from a democracy to a dictatorship in the 1930s. So thanks very much for listening to that revision video for topic 2, Hitler's rise to power. I hope you enjoyed that, hope you learned a lot, and good luck with your GCSEs. Bye bye.